Hello, beautiful community. Happy Sunday. Now, Russian propaganda is again, with a degree of success, eating into some of the truthful narratives that seem to have been established about the Russo-Ukrainian war over the last few years. Why is this happening? Now, partly it's because a might is right ideology is doing the rounds across the globe and to a degree taking off in the United States. Partly it's because history absorbs events, absorbs narratives about events, and encourages a kind of psychology of moral disgust, whereby all the ghastliness and unloveliness of things going on in the world comes to be overwhelming to the point that you say it's all a version of ghastly normal. But it's constructive in of itself, and for transferable skills reasons, a term I normally hate, but it's actually useful in this area because you want to apply a good way of thinking about a conflict to the way you think about other conflicts. And we'll talk about other conflicts soon. We're going to have a very big conversation about Gaza in the next few days, I hope. But it's useful not just in of itself, but for transferable skills reasons. So let's do it. What we're going to do is take on three very, very, very simple Russian propaganda untruths about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then we'll take on three more complex, pernicious Russian propaganda untruths about the invasion of Ukraine. So let's start with the basics. And I invite you to indulge me here, but I do hope we'll learn something along the way, even when we go through the basic points, three of which I've jotted down here. The first one is the denial by Russian propaganda that Russia invaded Ukraine at all. So this is the claim that Russia didn't invade Ukraine because it's much more complex than that. And of course, you believe, and I believe, that Ukraine didn't invade Russia, that Russia clearly invaded Ukraine, that this is as clear as the spirit of Clemenceau's remark at the Treaty of Versailles when he was asked what historians would make of the First World War, and he said that they're not going to say that Belgium invaded Germany. So this is so basic, we're not even going to rebut the Russian case, but we'll make an important observation that helps us. And that's that the truth that Russia invaded Ukraine is a factual truth. But it is not a blunt factual truth. It is a fact that is a few steps along the way toward being an interpretation, which actually most facts are. Some facts are flatter than others, and just because a fact requires interpretation does not mean that it stops being a fact. It's just what we might call a richer fact. Now, a very blunt fact might be something like that more than one army is engaged in military combat in Eastern Europe, or that particular models of military weaponry are flying about in Eastern Europe. These might be flat facts that don't require interpretation beyond a certain very limited degree. This does require interpretation because if you are seriously screwed up epistemically, or if you are deceptive, you could argue that there is no difference on any level of any kind, culturally, politically, between Russia and Ukraine, and therefore A can't invade B if there is no difference between A and B. You could also claim that Ukraine has no agency of any kind at all, thereby Ukraine is just a vanguard of the propulsion of US imperialism, for instance. So these are the kinds of Kremlin maneuvers that occur here, and we don't need to rebut them because they're ludicrous, but what we do need to point out is that it's an interesting illustration of how some facts are richer than others. But we also have to be clear and say that even though some facts are indeed more interpretive, we still have to insist on them being facts. The second claim that Russian propaganda makes is that there is this destruction in Ukraine, but it's not clear who is causing it. And you might say, well, come on, surely they're not saying that. And the answer is yes, they have. They're saying it less than they did at the beginning of the war, when they were saying it a lot. But it's still the case that if you put aside the minority of the Russian population that's clearly anti-Putin and anti-war, under 20%, and a minority of the Russian population that's clearly pro-war, under 20%. You look at the depoliticized blob in the middle. That blob outsources to Putin not just decision-making in politics, but conceptualization about politics. That's to say, they are quite open to saying, well, I can see this destruction, but it certainly shouldn't be up to me to work out who's done it. Is it the Russians? Is it the Ukrainians? Is it the Americans? Is it aliens launching weapons at Ukraine from behind planet Jupiter and so on? That's beyond our pay grade to work this out. So all we can document is the destruction. How it's coming about, nobody really knows. What we want to say here, clearly, is that Ukrainian villages and towns are being hit. They're being hit by Russian weaponry launched by Russians. This is actually a flatter factual claim than the first claim. This requires slightly less interpretation. But it's worth noting that it is a very basic factual claim that is nevertheless denied by Russian propaganda at times, and to a degree also not quite believed by some of the depoliticized blob that constitutes a majority in the Russian population. Funnily enough, the folks who are pro-war are not going to make this denial. They're more likely going to simply say, yes, it's the Russians who are doing it, and we're justified in doing it. Which shows what a cacophony of multiplicity of conflictive messages are necessary to keep going the kind of partly politicized, partly depoliticized informational environment that Russia is. The third claim that's made, that is blatantly false by Russian propaganda, we shouldn't dwell on much, is the least factual of the first three, but it is nevertheless blatantly wrong. And that's that while the Russians are attacking Ukraine, they're not harming Ukraine, they're liberating Ukraine. Now, you need such a broad conception of liberation here that your concept of liberation needs to include every human predicament that is the very opposite of liberation in it. And if that's the case, then your concept of liberation just means nothing at all. How do you respond to this claim? Well, you respond to it by noticing that to justify this, the Russians are going to need a kind of a spectacular metaphysical or psychological account of false consciousness that is simply unavailable. Because it doesn't get beyond the test of an elementary question. Are any humans within their polity going to be happy about it if bombs are falling on their heads and if they're being screwed over by losing family members, by losing economically, losing civically, losing demographically, losing culturally? All bits of your life are being attacked and destroyed. Are you going to like it? What kind of psychology would a human being need to have to be in that predicament and like it, is the question you have to ask. And then in response to that, they would have to paint a psychology that cannot be a psychology that belongs to any reasonable human being. So let's now move on to four more, if you like, profound and insidious propaganda claims. So number 4, the first of these three, we're going to do 4, 5, 6, is the idea that the Russian invasion does contain wrong, but that it is necessary. As Russian propaganda likes to say, мы были вынуждены. They made us do it. Really. This Russian idea is dependent upon an account of Ukraine as a threat to Russia. But you might say, hang on, if Russia doesn't invade Ukraine, there is no prospect of Ukraine invading Russia, unless you're completely nuts. Nor is there a prospect of the West using Ukraine as a platform to launch weapons at Russia. You can't imagine a meeting in Washington or a meeting between European leaders that discusses the prospect of, why don't we sort of just lob a couple of missiles into Russian territory out of the blue? And what about that as something we could do next Tuesday? Right? That's absolutely absurd. So what kind of a threat could they be talking about? Well, I do think that there is a certain account of a threat that is plausible. And it's this. Putin feels that all forms of domestic instability are in fact expressions of foreign attack on him. Nobody can actually oppose Putin domestically except forces that are simply expressions of malign foreign interference in Russia's sovereign affairs. And thinking along these lines, Putin imagines, with much trauma from his observation of the demise of folks like Gaddafi, that if a time comes when his regime is less stable, having Ukraine next to Russia's border, even if Ukraine isn't part of NATO or the European Union, but just is moderately independent and moderately democratic, that could exert a very considerable degree of influence over what happens on Russian territory at that point, and could tip the balance in the direction of Putin losing power or indeed losing his life. So there is a tenuous but nevertheless realistic sense in which the very existence of Ukraine is seen by Putin as a threat to his body. However, even if we admit that there's a degree of logic to this, we have to point out that that's not a very good conceptualization of a legitimate threat you face. I'm a tyrant who's illegitimately trying to keep power in a country. I'm worried about the instability of my affairs at home, and I'm worried about how that might be impacted by any neighbors of mine that happen to just have the status of running their own affairs. Right? You could say, well, that is a certain kind of a threat to the Putin regime, but it's not an account of a threat that we can accept. Right? It's just like me saying that my neighbor constitutes a threat to me doing something utterly outrageous and illegal here at home, because they might bring it about that I can't continue that activity. Now, here two distinctions really matter, and I won't labor them because you can work out what they mean. The first distinction says that there is a difference between a threat and an existential threat. Countries and alliances threaten one another in all kinds of ways, but it doesn't mean they face existential threats from one another. That distinction really matters. And you could make the case that France threatens the UK in some way. Well, that's not going to be a reason for the UK to invade France. So there is a difference between threats, and there is certainly a difference between threats and existential threats. There is then another difference between things that threaten or existentially threaten Russia in some form or other, versus Russia as an imperial, borderless, expansive project. Right? You can make the case that certain things threaten Russia in that latter sense without them being things that threaten Russia conceived of differently. So what you might say is, yes, you might feel threatened by that, but what's threatened by it isn't Russia's sovereignty, but it's the exercise of Russia's sovereignty as conceived along certain kinds of borderless and imperially expansive lines. So let's get to the fifth point. And that's that indeed the two people are the same. How do we challenge that? Because what you don't want to do is say something kitsch that implies that Russia and Ukraine have nothing culturally in common, right? You sometimes can get resonances of that from certain kinds of shrill professional patriot activism online, of a pro-Ukrainian kind. But the reality is these are two countries that do indeed share very considerable amounts culturally. Right. I mean, let's say I am psychologically very Western, and some of the ways that Russians and Ukrainians are different from me are going to be ways that overlap, clearly. So what do we say then about this? Let's start like this. When the Russians invaded, the spirit of the Ukrainian military was high, and the spirit of the Ukrainian territorial defense was high. And Kremlin was wrong to assume that they could convert what is essentially a full-scale war into a policing operation via the local population accommodating them. That's what they thought would happen. Now, if you sent a 12-year-old even into eastern parts of Ukraine in early 2022 and ask a 12-year-old to objectively report whether they think Ukrainians are going to allow the Russians to engage in a policing operation, whether they would interpret it as a proper invasion, the 12-year-old would say, well, then interpret it as a proper invasion. So, and this is a remarkable expression of a kind of unboundariness that persists in Russian culture and threatens us all, in fact, as this might is right ideology does the rounds. The idea that it's okay and even appropriate to do something if you have the power to do it. And a victim of yours doesn't have the power to defend themselves. So it's a case of deeply pathological unboundariness, both personally and politically expressed, as a fault in many cultures, but a particular fault of Russian culture at this historical moment, I'm afraid, that generated this situation whereby the Kremlin thought they could get away with a policing operation. But in fact, the Ukrainians said, this is our country, and had a degree of civic mobilization in response to Russia's invasion and said, we're going to stand up to this. So, if you want to point out the way Russia and Ukraine are different, you start with politics. You start with a different way of relating to politics. We might talk about this another time. I think there is quite a difference in images of political mythology between the two countries. But for today's purposes, all we need to say is that while there are other differences too, the absolutely major difference is a political difference. And the starting point for talking about it is in fact unwillingness to collaborate or submit to foreign military aggression. Because it's not just that leads to a conversation about a healthy civic nationalism in Ukraine, or other forms of nationalism in Ukraine, and not all of them are healthy, but a civic form of nationalism is very healthy that's in Ukraine. But it also leads to a conversation about the absence of such a sense of nationalism in Russia. What happened in Kursk, clearly, is that Russians were a bit more ambiguous about being invaded by Ukraine than Ukrainians were about being invaded by Russia. Now, I'm making an exaggeration here, but it's not as though there is no grain of truth to it. That is quite interesting. And that is a very big political difference. Because Ukrainians are viscerally unhappy if Russians invade them. Whereas for many Russians, if Ukraine were a bigger power and invaded them, it'd be easier to say, shall we see how this goes? And it could be better, you never know. So there's a kind of relation Russian population has to Moscow and the Kremlin, as though that itself were a kind of imperial center of power, to a degree exercising colonial rule over them. This is a much bigger conversation, but the big bucket I advise you to wheel out at this point is that the two cultures have a very, very different relationship to politics and different political mythology. A minority of Russians who oppose Putin and oppose the war may feel like they wish to share in that, That's a separate conversation. But if we're to make generalizations, there is that difference. And in some of the protests we saw recently in Ukraine, again, we had that illustrated. So Russia is not Ukraine. Ukraine is not Russia. And the key point here is that the two countries are different in how they relate to politics. 6. Yeah, what Russia is doing is harmful to Ukraine. It's certainly no liberation. It's bad. It's really bad. And it might not even be necessary. But other big powers do it too. So why can't they? Or why can't we? What do you say about that? What about Britain and the Opium Wars? Or what about Gaza today? And here is my big piece of advice here. It's a mistake to respond to that argument by assessing it. What about America? It's a mistake to respond to that argument immediately by saying, okay, let's look at all the ways in which the United States violated the sovereignty of other countries since the Second World War. I mean, the list is actually going to be enormous there. But it's a mistake to respond by straight away making an assessment and comparing who is worse and who is better, Russia or the United States. What you rather need to do is respond by wondering whether or not, by challenging these questions, by wondering whether or not it's been asked too early, in such a way that the question becomes self-refuting. Because if every time you're dealing with a particular war or particular conflict, you straight away ask, what about this other war and this other conflict? You're never going to understand anything about the first war and the first conflict. Because you can only engage with it in terms of your engagement with others. But if you always say, what about another instance, it's not just that you'll never learn anything about this particular war, it's that you won't ever learn anything about these other wars which you're bringing up, because about them it is also possible to engage in this cascading carousel. What about something else? If every time you say, what about A, I say, what about B, then every time I say, what about B, someone else can say, what about C? And then you're going to have a cascade whereby nobody knows anything about any of the conflicts going on. So you can say, yes, that's a good question, but if that's the first thing you ask, you can go screw yourself, because that way nobody's going to know anything about anything. So it's self-refuting to straight away ask, what about this? Right? If a burglar breaks into your house here in the UK, right, and you say, what are you doing here? And the burglar says, well, actually, don't you know, crime has been historically high in Britain, you know, since the Home Office first published crime statistics upon the founding of the Metropolitan Police in 1834. I said, dude, you're inside my house, you've stolen my laptop, and it looks like you're going to whack me over the head with some kind of weapon you got. How was the Metropolitan Police Force in 1834 relevant to this? We could discuss that a year on in some kind of seminar about the prevalence of crime in the UK. But now you're in my house. So you see, there is something very bogus about immediately suspending all imminence when it comes to the way we're engaging with a conflict. There's something spurious, there's something bogus about that. The problem isn't that it's never okay to make a comparative evaluation. The problem rather is that if you ask that question in the wrong context or too quickly, it's not just that it's going to be inappropriate, but it's going to be self-refuting, because you're going to end up with a world in which no conflict can possibly be engaged with or attended to or understood, because it's always about what about something else. Well, even if crime has been high since 1834 in the UK, because we've been counting it since, that does not undermine the fact that it's uncool for you, Mr. Burglar, to be in my house right now. So, these are the 6 points I wanted to address with a little bit of clarity. Thank you very much for being with me.